Hey y'all, howdy, welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell. So today I wanted to talk about every book I read in quarter one, which was January, February, and March. I read 34 books total, and I just pulled out one quotation from each book that I thought either really spoke to me or really spoke to the character of the book. In addition to that, just to give you guys a little more context, I will mention the genre, and I'm going to do a one-sentence plot teaser in case you don't know anything about the books that I'm going to mention. Oh, and I will mention my favorite books of each month when we get through them. That's the premise for the video. Let's get into it. I kicked off the year with The 10,000 Doors of January by Alex E. Harrow, which is a fantasy novel. The premise is a girl finds a door that leads to another world. It's a profoundly strange feeling to stumble across someone whose desires are shaped so closely to your own, like reaching toward your reflection in a mirror and finding warm flesh under your fingertips. If you should ever be lucky enough to find that magical, fearful symmetry, I hope you're brave enough to grab it with both hands and not let go. The second book I read was Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, which is a contemporary literary novel. The premise is two friends who met in childhood decide to create video games together as adults. This is what time travel is. It's looking at a person and seeing them in the present and the past concurrently, and that mode of transport only worked with those one had known for a significant time. The third book I read was the first book in Mistborn Era 2, which is called The Alloy of Law by Brandon Sanderson. This is a fantasy novel. The premise is a lawman from the Roughs has to move back to the city to manage his family's estate. To be of use in even a single burst of flame and sound is worth more than a lifetime of achieving nothing. Then I read the second book in Mistborn Era 2 called The Shadows of Self by Brandon Sanderson. Since this is the second book, the premise is kind of like the city didn't turn out to be the peaceful existence that the lawmen expected. When she fought, she was the blade. When she loved, she was the kiss. I just love that one. Then third book in Mistborn Era 2. Oh my god. My cat is yelling at me. Oh my god. Okay. Cats. Let's make sure my hair looks good. Oh Lord. Okay, moving on to book 3 of Mistborn Era 2, which is, again, fantasy. And this is The Bands of Mourning. And in this one, essentially, the lawman needs to hunt down a magical artifact before his enemies get to it and use it for evil. It seems like we're just along for the ride, even in our own lives. But once in a while, we do face a choice, a real one. We may not be able to choose what happens to us or where we'll stop, but we point ourselves in a direction. Then I took a little break from Mistborn Era 2, and I read What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher, which is a horror novel, and it is a retelling of the fall of the House of Usher. So if you're not familiar with that, the premise is basically a friend goes to check in on some childhood acquaintances, and they live in a very creepy house. Probably there's a country where people aren't embarrassed to be poor, but I've yet to travel there. So after that, I read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, which is a historical fiction about a young woman who manipulates men in order to further her acting career in Hollywood. And this was my favorite book of January. I absolutely love The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. The key to impulsivity is believing you're invincible. No one goes around throwing caution to the wind unless the wind is blowing their way. Then I finished up Mistborn Era 2 with The Lost Metal by Brandon Sanderson. And in this one, the lawmen must save the city from total annihilation and defeat the bad guys. City folk, particularly politicians, were intimidated by small arms. They preferred to kill people with more modern weapons, like poverty and despair. Next up, I read a Warhammer 40K book, which is science fiction, and this was For the Emperor by Sandy Mitchell. The premise is a famous soldier is given command of a new battalion and has to succeed in battle while not letting on that he's actually a huge coward. Diplomacy is just warfare by other means. Our battles are not less desperate for being bloodless, but at least we get wine and finger food. Then I read a nonfiction book called The Elephant Whisperer by Lawrence Anthony with Graham Spence. And this is about a man who owns an African game reserve, and he took in a family of elephants who were problematic for attacking humans in order to save them from being put down. It was not civilization that eroded the spirit world. It was electric light at night, the light that took away the dark, blinded us to ghosts, angels, and demons, and vanquished our ancestors. My last book for the month of January was The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which is a science fiction book, and the premise is aliens invade and quickly overpower 1800s England. I felt the first inkling of a thing that presently grew quite clear in my mind, that oppressed me for many days, a sense of dethronement, a persuasion that I was no longer a master, but an animal among the animals, under the Martian heel. With us, it would be as with them, to lurk and watch, to run and hide. The fear and empire of man had passed away. My first book for the month of February was Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This is a science fiction novel, and the premise is a Black woman from 1970s LA is thrown back in time to slavery-era Maryland. Even people who loved me could demand more of me than I could give, and expect their demands to be met simply because I owed them. My second book for the month of February was The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, which is a sci-fantasy book, and the premise is cities gain a soul once their population is high enough and their culture is unique enough, and the powers of the city are channeled through human avatars. He is falling in love with the city, and men in love are not always considerate or wise. Next up, I read The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson, which is a sci-fi novel. In this one, a woman travels through parallel worlds for her company, but along the way finds out that the company is not what they seem. I'm so good at not making an impression, it's a wonder I even leave footprints. Next up was a historical fiction novel called The Birds of Opulence by Crystal Wilkinson. This is a generational tale of Black women suffering from mental illness in a small rural town. Imagine yourself a woman who gathers stories in her apron. Next up was Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James. This is a fantasy novel about a man with a superhuman sense of smell who is hired to track down a missing boy. Lots of trigger warnings with this book, and just want to throw it out there that I did not enjoy this book at all, and I don't recommend it. A man will suffer misery to get to the bottom of truth, but he will not suffer boredom. Then I read Riot Baby by Tochi Onyebuchi, which is a sci-fantasy novel, and it is about a boy born during the Rodney King riots who later in life is incarcerated and gets visits from his sister who has supernatural powers. They freed the slaves at gunpoint. Then I read The Final Strife by Sarah El Arifi. This is a fantasy novel about children who are raised by the resistance movement who try to infiltrate the ruling class in order to overthrow societal power structures. His eyes crinkled with the wisdom of other people's stories. Then I read a collection of poetry called Reparations Now by Ashley M. Jones. That's the least I'm owed. To know I'm worth heaven, yes, but also worth a life on earth. Then I finished up The Great Cities duology, which is the sequel to The City We Became with The World We Make by N.K. Jemisin. This is, again, a sci-fantasy novel. And in this one, alien forces from other universes are trying to destroy the living cities, and the avatars must band together to fight back. A living city blends the will of its citizens with the impressions of outsiders, as filtered through legends and media. Then I read a novella called Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. This is a sci-fi. Binti is a girl from an insular African community, and she runs away to attend the most prestigious universe in the galaxy. I could only be great if I were curious enough to seek greatness. Sequel to Binti was called Home, another sci-fi novel, and basically after a year at university, Binti returns home to kind of face up to the consequences of her actions. The spirits and ghosts of the dead don't stay where they're freed. The third novella in the Binti series was called The Night Masquerade. In this one, war breaks out between people on Binti's home planet and the people of the friends she's made at the university. When elephants fight, the grass suffers. My last book for the month of February was my favorite book for the month of February, and this was Ring Shout by P. Jolly Clark. This is a horror novel about demons who feed on hate that have infiltrated the KKK and a community of Black demon hunters who are trying to find them and stop them before they take over the world. What I have is beautiful music inspired by struggle and fierce love. What he got ain't nothing but hateful noise. Not a hint of soul to it, like unseasoned meat. My first book for the month of March was a nonfiction called The Saint Who Would Be Santa Claus by Adam C. English. This book was an attempt to separate historical records from myth about the figure known as Saint Nicholas of Myra. Why, Neil George wondered, would children worship God if Saint Nicholas delivered the presents? Then I read a fantasy novel by Fonda Lee called Jade City. This is the first book in the Greenbone saga, and essentially Jade gives people superpowers and mafias control the jade industry. And if you love someone, truly loved them, shouldn't their happiness matter more, even more than your honor? The sequel to Jade City is Jade War, and this one, the two major mafia families go to war, but they're also at the same time trying to protect their country from foreign interests. The possibility of death was like the weather. You could make attempts to predict it, but you would likely be wrong, and no one would change their most important plans due to threat of rain. And finally, the third book in the Greenbone saga is Jade Legacy. This was my favorite book for the month of March. Absolutely bawled my eyes out at the end. And in this one, the families are dealing with the changing cultural landscape and what jade will mean for their descendants. I feel like I gave very poor descriptions of all three of those books, but you can look it up if you want to know more. You'd think it would be easier to face death as you get older, but it doesn't work that way. You get more attached to life, to the people you love and things that are worth living for. Then I read Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. This is a sci-fi novel about three people across the centuries who are connected by a rift in the space-time continuum. Pandemics don't approach like wars, with the distant thud of artillery growing louder every day and flashes of bombs on the horizon. They arrive in retrospect, essentially. It's disorienting. The pandemic is far away, and then it's all around you, with seemingly no intermediate step. That one hits. Then I read Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, which is a fantasy novel, and the premise is a man lives in an infinite house full of mysteries. Perhaps even people you like and admire immensely can make you see the world in ways you would rather not. Then I read Turning Darkness into Light by Marie Brennan, which is a companion novel to the Memoirs of Lady Trent series and fantasy. The premise for this one is that a scholar of the ancient Draconian language is hired to translate some tablets that were uncovered, but she uncovers a conspiracy while doing so. Unfortunately, all of my highlights in my Kindle didn't save for this book. So this quote's not my favorite one from the book. It was just the first one I could find. And I think this quote works better if you imagine it in like a Victorian lady's voice. At the moment, I have plenty to keep myself busy with, and whatever I'm going to throw myself at next, I'll know it when I see it. Then I read a nonfiction book about writing craft called Story Genius by Lisa Cron. And this is a book that focuses on crafting character arcs first instead of plot. The only way to change how someone thinks about something is to first change how they feel about it. Then I read another nonfiction book by Amanda Montell called Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism. This is a deep dive into the language used by cults to capture their followers, with examples from every part of the spectrum of what a cult is. Smart people are better at defending beliefs they arrived at for non-smart reasons. And finally, the last book that I read in the month of March was a historical fiction book called Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is a documentary-style interview with a hit 1970s band, and the interview takes place like a decade or more after the band has split up. Music can dig, you know? It can take a shovel to your chest and just start digging until it hits something. So those were all 34 books that I read in the first 3 months of the year, a little brief, kind of silly synopsis for each one, and some of my favorite quotations. I will say some of these books had like dozens of quotations that I wanted to use, so it was really hard to narrow it down to one. But I hope this gives you a little taste of what it was like to read these books, and I hope it inspired you to pick one of them up and read them. Please like this video if you enjoyed this content, and And as always, be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button below for more bookish content to come. See you next time.